Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you in my Patch by Patch series. It's been a good bit since I did one of these. In the last one, we covered patch point 10, which had some pretty major stuff going on. The level cap was increased to 60, the raid grouping system was implemented, and we saw the release of the Stratholme dungeon and the Blackrock Spire raid, and also the Winter Spring, Western, and Eastern Plagueland zones, and the last remnants of that old skill point system finally saw its end. I wanted to make this video a twofer because these patches are kind of small in comparison. They're the final two patches before release, so it makes sense that they're not doing these huge sweeping changes, just trying to smooth out the more major systems and get some semblance of stability, I guess. Starting with the most major stuff though, first up we have the new models and animations. By now in this series, you've probably noticed that all of the models are just slightly different than what you're used to for classic World of Warcraft. The humans skip leg day, maybe the sitting emotes are different, dwarves have a different posture and, do that when they take fall damage. This patch saw an update to most of these models, and we ended up with races that we all know and love. People ask all the time for an option for new models and animations for the re-release of Classic, but I'm still waiting on those original female trolls, man. Like seriously, who looked at this and said, "Nice, looks good. 2 arms, 2 legs, makes sense to me." As you can see, the Taurens had a Hunchback of Notre Dame thing going on, but don't be fooled by their large stature. As it turns out, they're quite limber. And if you look closely, the Night Elf breasts are 50% more bouncy. And female gnomes are, yeah, let's just move on, huh? So, new models and animations to make things look a bit prettier in this patch. Next though, we have Warlock talents. Not actually the final trees to be added to the game, as the release patch 1.1 would see the reveal of the Paladin and Hunter trees. Now unfortunately, I can't find the original .11 trees. As you can see, the Demonology tree has yet to be implemented, so we'll just have to settle for the .12 talents instead. As far as I know, these are all the same, it's just that we have the Demonology tree here. As for the original Warlock trees though, it's surprisingly similar to the final 1.12 talents. It seems like they hit it right on the money for what they wanted for the Warlock. For the other classes, we saw some strange things, such as that pesky troll regeneration racial rearing its ugly head. But for Warlock, it's pretty similar. One thing I noticed is that their Ruin talent used to be called Holocaust, so that was changed for obvious reasons. And here you can see that Warlocks have a nice buff to getting stoned, so that's always nice. Speaking of which though, and this was something that persisted through Classic, but their Firestones actually gave some bonus damage to melee attacks, which is kinda strange. So sort of a melee element to them, like the old Discipline Priests, which might seem odd, but I think it's something that came more from the Dungeons and Dragons scene, which I'm sure influenced World of Warcraft quite a bit. If only there was an original class designer still around to ask these questions. Well, it just so happens that there is. Kevin Jordan was one of the original designers of the game, and the man responsible for all of this stuff. He was the main class designer for Vanilla World of Warcraft, and he streams quite a bit on twitch.tv, so I want to give him a quick plug here. Definitely check him out if you want to hear some perspective of the game in both its current and classic state, or just an entertaining stream in general. But anyways, another big change is the addition of new loot methods, which were pretty important. We have the group loot, which brings up a loot window whenever an item drops. This was before the need and greed era, as the only 2 options were roll or pass. That was only added in patch 1.7, where they distinguished between need and greed, not to be confused with the need before greed loot option, which just auto-passes items that certain players can't even use. So just some added loot protection here. Most guilds, if they were smart, would opt for the Master Looter, and just use third-party methods of distributing items such as Dragon Killing Points, or DKP for short, which was a loot system that was first adapted in the EverQuest game actually. Basically, you get these points for killing raid bosses or donating to the guild, and you use them as a currency to bid on items against other guild members. Players would also use loot councils, where the higher-ranking members decide who gets what. And for those who liked complete anarchy, you also had the manual/rolling system, but that was risky because stuff like this would happen.
Other than rogues, because all the rogues can't roll on it. Han, what are you doing?
What the fuck? Oh my god!
What the fuck?
Oh my god! I'm going to kill myself right now. See ya!
Rest assured though, no matter what you did, drama quickly arose over who should get these items and who shouldn't. Epics were epic back then, to say the least. While leveling, you mostly had greens, and maybe a couple of blues here and there, so seeing a purple was extremely rare. So at the end game, these would be coveted ultra-powerful items that everyone wanted, and with 40-man raids, there simply weren't enough to go around. Friendships forged over the course of years fell victim to the power of the mighty pixel.
You piece of shit! You piece of shit! I can't believe you. Oh my god.
Wow, man.
And he has my motherfucking gloves, too!
So they did their best to provide a means for players to hand them out in an organized fashion, but ultimately, it was up to the guilds and players. But next, going into the more minor stuff of Point 11, the Undead race lost their ability to speak Common, instead now having Gutter Speak as their main language. We talked about this earlier in the series, so I won't stick on this for too long, but of course, once being human, Undead players did retain their fluency in the Common tongue, and they were able to understand and talk to other Alliance players. It was removed probably to maintain that faction separation, which was more important back then, and probably because players weren't playing too nice, I like to imagine. Another funny change I thought is that water walking no longer works on lava. Lava was very deadly back then, as you'd imagine, so I'd like to think that some poor shaman not reading the patch notes and just jumping into a pool of lava to their doom. Well, it serves them right. Dirty horde. And this is kind of off topic here, but a little fun fact for you is that the original way to zone into the Molten Core was to go through this window right here in the Blackrock Mountain. If things were working correctly, you'd zone right in. However, back then, there were issues with instances, and sometimes you'd fail to load, and you'd then be dumped into the lava instead to certain death, while some developers just laughing his ass off probably. We know your game, Kevin. Don't try to hide it. And another issue was, at first, due to their size, Torrent weren't able to even zone into the raid because they couldn't fit through the window. This was all remedied in patch 1.3 though, when they added Lothos Riftwalker to simply teleport players inside the raid. And another trolly thing here is that this patch updated the Mage Portals. They now require you to click on them to go to the city, which if I'm understanding this correctly, previously it was just based off of proximity. So you probably had these mages opening portals on unsuspecting party members. Hey, that's one way to get loot. Just wait until the boss is almost dead, and port the unsuspecting Warlock to Darnassus. As you can see, this patch was also when they removed armor type from Cloaks. Ever wonder why there are so many Cloaks in the game, especially early on, or why some were specified as chain but didn't give any bonus armor? Well, it's all a remnant of this old cloak system. But that's about it for patch 0.11. Like I said though, I also wanted to cover patch 0.12. The biggest change here probably is the addition of durability to the game. This is another point to bring up in regards to the casual nature of the game back then. Once again, bringing up Star Wars Galaxies here, this game also had a durability system, but it was much more harsh. If an item's condition drained all of the way, it was broken forever. You could repair it in this game as well, but it wasn't a guaranteed thing. There were a few outcomes, and that's 1, the item is fully repaired, 2, the item is repaired, but the max durability is reduced, and 3, you fail completely, and the item just breaks right then and there. So, any item you'd get would eventually break. Can you imagine in World of Warcraft getting your Hand of Ragnaros, and then 2 weeks later you lose it because you failed in a repair? Again, it just goes to show that during the time, World of Warcraft was aimed for that casual market back then, and it says a lot about where the genre has gone as a whole, since as you know, people look back to Classic as being quote hardcore in many aspects compared to current. But durability is still super important because it was the biggest gold sink back then, and probably still is today in fact. Spells, professions, and mount training were all expensive back then, but she would eventually max all of that out. Repairs on the other hand were present at every stage of the game, at level 1 and at level 60 in Extremis rating, and they were quite harsh for more heavily armored players as I recall. It was common back then for guilds to fund the repair costs for their main tanks because, well, they died the most, and usually being protection, it was more time consuming for them to grind gold outside of the raids. Certainly something that would have outraged beta testers when it was released, since I'm sure gold was already pretty hard to come by. But next, we have the release of the Scholomance dungeon. In the previous episode, we previewed the Isle of Caradero, and we talked a bit about how it may have turned out to be an outside questing area, but in this patch, we got the Caradero that we all know and love, and Scholomance was officially added as a dungeon, and it was a good choice because it was one of the more iconic dungeons in the game, serving as a school of necromancy and shadow magic for Kel'Thuzad's minions. This place held the iconic Tier 0 headpieces for each class. Everyone wanted the head and shoulders back then, mainly because they're the most noticeable, but the dungeon as a whole is impeccable, as with most dungeons in Classic. This is where the paladins finished that great quest chain for their epic mount. You'd head into the basement here and defend a phylactery for multiple waves of enemies, each being vulnerable to certain paladin seals. It climaxed with the Dark Master Gandling boss, who was one of the few multiple phase bosses in the game at that point, teleporting players into the surrounding rooms and locking them inside until they kill all of the zombies. He had a chance to drop this staff, which was highly sought after by casters back then. Like I said, anything purple would be like an oh snap moment. Everyone would stop in their tracks and try to come up with ways to justify just why it's ultimately a hunter weapon. Secrets were abound, summonable bosses, a key to collect, and it also held an alchemy lab. You needed this to make flasks back then, and prior to the Blackwing Lair raid, it was the only one in the game, so you'd always see alchemists wanting to run this place for the table alone. The Ragefire Chasm dungeon was also added in this patch. This one was alright. I don't know, it's a horde dungeon, so I don't think anyone really cares about that, right? It's a pretty straightforward place, but it makes sense since it's a low-level dungeon. Speaking of which though, a change with the Superior Alliance dungeon, the Deadmines, is that the miners were made to be no longer elite. There were a ton of these guys, so this place would have taken you hours to get through, I'd imagine. And another change here is that you can no longer complete quests while in a raid. Not really too much to say about this one, just kind of interesting I thought that it was possible at one point. Obviously some issues with balance though. And here we also have finishing Duels now removes debuffs from players. I imagine Warlocks were pretty fun to duel since they would win, you'd be stopped at 1 health, and then a dot ticks and actually kills you. Maybe that's why they gave a 30-minute cooldown to their banish spell. Some developer lost one too many duels to a Warlock, I'm thinking. But speaking of which, they finally made it have no cooldown this patch, and also removed the reagent cost. But here we have an interesting change, and that Spirit no longer affects item proc percentage. As you know, this ended up just being for health and mana regeneration, and was one of the weaker stats for most classes in the game in general, aside from leveling maybe. So I guess this is why he saw so much of it in the game. This was all over the Shadowcraft set, which seemed like a big waste, but at one point it was more powerful, and when they removed its effect on proc rates, they just neglected to change any of the items that had it. But that's pretty much it. For each of these videos, I'd also like to add a section at the end of players reacting to all of this stuff. There do exist archives of the forums during the time. Patch .11 was September 29th, 2004, and .12 was October 11th. Unfortunately, you can't look at the actual threads, but the titles still give us enough to work with, so let's take a look and see what the players are thinking. Well, damn. Well, it looks like the internet was pretty much the same back then. These people act as if World of Warcraft took their imaginary girlfriends or something. Wait, make women less naked? Okay, now you've gone too far. I also like this one. Such eloquence in communicating his frustrations with Blizzard's monthly fee. Looking at the other posts, it was actually quite a controversial thing back then, which surprised me. It seemed like it was common practice with any MMO. I think a big reason is that there were a lot of fans coming from the Warcraft games, so they were used to that one-time purchase setup. But you have to give credit to Larson74 here, asking the real questions, although I think we all know the answer. Here we see a thread about durability. Like I said, players were probably pretty unhappy to see it added to the game, and it's a shame that we can't get into the actual thread and see what... Okay, now it's really a shame. Is anyone actually buying this? If only you knew, Anvil Man. If only you knew. But that's about it. This concludes our coverage of pre-release World of Warcraft. We're just getting started though, because in the next video, we'll talk about the day of November 23rd, 2004. A date that changed the world of Warcraft. I hope that you found the video interesting or entertaining. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.